I enjoy doing this podcast each and every single episode, but some are just kind of fun and lighthearted, and this is going to be one of those. I'm a man of simple tastes. I enjoy hanging out with my family. I enjoy learning about the gospel. I like watching football while eating a bag of Doritos and washing it down with an ice-cold Diet Pepsi. But what I really like to do when I'm not sitting in front of a hot mic is smoking brisket or grilling steak. But if you're like me, you've stopped a couple times and asked the question, am I eating meat sparingly? Well, fellow carnivores, rejoice. Today on the podcast, I have Joshua Erickson on as we take a deep dive into the Word of Wisdom and really take a good look at that portion where it talks about the consumption of meat. So get ready for a delicious episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Look, it's no secret that our society has become much more crude and coarse. To become and raise men and women of virtue and character is a Herculean task. To help with this, I have recently wrote and published a book. Now, back in the 1700s, Washington had a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. It was a book with 110 rules that talked about how to conduct yourself like a civilized person in society, something that today's society is sorely lacking. What I did is I went back through the book and I reinterpreted his original sayings for the 21st century. So the book is laid out in a way in which you see Washington's original rule. Right below that is my explanation for the 21st century, and below that you'll find 2 or 3 examples of where to use this in the real world. Now, to go along with this, there's a workbook that helps parents teach these principles and practices to their kids. To find the book, go to MormonRenegade.com, go to the bottom of the page, search out the blog post, and order your copy today. I can bear personal testimony from personal experience that this is an invaluable tool to help you raise men and women of virtue and character. So to my fellow carnivores, all those folks that just love a good steak, maybe some brisket, some chicken, I have got some great news for you. Yay, this episode you could really call the gospel what it is, the good news. So Joshua, when
this is some meaty, juicy stuff.
Juicy, right? Meaty, like savory, over the fire kind of stuff. So
sweet savor,
yes. So if you're a vegetarian, first off, if you're a vegetarian for the reasons I think most people listening to this podcast are, you could be a little disappointed. I want to throw that out there right away. If you're a vegetarian because you have ethical problems killing animals, you are a rock star. I get it. But I'm not that guy. So this may not be the episode for you if you're a vegetarian. But nonetheless, in all seriousness, I want to say this. When I first heard Joshua here give this presentation at the Torah conference, one, I was just extremely happy. I went home with my faith renewed. My cup, it overflowed. But it does actually point to some misunderstandings we might have about the Word of Wisdom, specifically the part having to do with eating meat. So with that, Joshua, why don't you just take it from there?
Start out there. Okay.
First off, what got you interested in this, right?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Yeah. I will say it was a struggle that I had, a difficulty in interpreting the scriptures. Because and I've talked about this before, my faith is that the God that we worship does not change his mind about things. about his commandments, about what is pleasing and not. He doesn't. Yeah. So, and yet, when when I read the Doctrine and Covenants, when I read section 89, in times past, not anymore, but in times past, I read some things in there that didn't seem to harmonize with some of the things in the Old Testament, especially. So, in section 89, I've got here word of wisdom.
Well, before you go there, I want to share just a quick
Okay.
personal experience with this, because I too had a few issues with the word of wisdom as far as the eating of meat. And this comes from a real world experience of mine. So this was about a year before I started the podcast. And my doctor, he's like, you're like 43. Not going to lie, you're chunky, right? You got some girth to you. I'm bigger. I was bigger then than I am now. He's like, let's get some blood work. So he takes some blood work and he said, you need to get back in here.
Okay.
I was like, uh-oh. And he's like, bring your wife. Now, me and my doctor, he's kind of an old school doctor, so he knew damn well that if he doesn't
follow the doctor's orders,
I'm not going to follow. Right. He's got to have my wife in there. Right.
All right.
So Amber comes with me and the doctor says, look, you want to cut down on how badly you feel. Cause I tore an ACL and I had constant inflammation.
No good.
He's like, so we need to figure out what we're going to do. And I said, okay, let me guess, all vegetables and blah, blah, blah. He said, well, most guys, I'd say yes. He said, but because I know that you're not going to follow that anyway,
okay,
I want to kind of run an experiment with you, and we'll keep close tabs on you, and we'll go from there. Now, I have a buddy, I won't name the university because I don't want to get him in trouble, but he's in kinesiology.
Okay. I
talked to him about it, and he said, yeah, go for it. So the experiment was this. My doctor had this idea that the food pyramid, as we use it now, isn't correct.
You can almost bet that. Like, came from the government.
And he said that in his studies, he found that the study that was done that pegged sclerosis of the arteries, plaque in your arteries, was the second study that was done. The first study that was done pointed to refined sugars and refined carbs. Right? Yeah. Pastas, breads, candy, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
When that came back, that particular lobby went, I got a pile full of money here that bets you can come up with a better study. Yeah. And then the animal fats were to blame. So he said, what I want to do, this is my doctor to me, he says, I want to put you on a high protein diet and with just raw vegetables. If you have a hankering for something sweet, some honey or fruit.
Okay.
That's what it was. So I was like, so I still get to eat steak? Yes, you still get to eat steak. I'm good. Now, when I left the doctor's office that day, I had high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and I weighed about 35 pounds more than what I do right now. We coupled that with exercise as well. And those were the only things we changed. And my exercise routine is a lot of heavy weight lifting and some intense interval training as far as cardio.
Okay.
I do that for 3 weeks and I go back in and have my cholesterol checked. The cholesterol is back down to where it should be.
Wow.
Good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. High blood pressure is gone. The hypertension is completely gone. My testosterone raised by a whole bunch.
Kudos to that doctor for not just
and so
prescribing you a drug for those things.
Right.
Like, let's change your life. That's a rare.
Yeah. And so as I looked at that and I did that, I was super happy with the outcome. And I felt different. All the inflammation left, right? Yeah. I didn't have the knee problems. Yeah. I didn't have the chronic pain I was having. I didn't have crashes throughout the day, because normally about 2:00 I could count on just wanting to take a nap.
Yeah.
I didn't have that anymore. And I was full all day. I wasn't feeling hungry all the
Starved
time
or whatever. Yeah.
But it still presented something that somewhat of a conflict with the word of wisdom. I felt like it was a conflict,
Right.
because it said to eat meat sparingly, and we'll get into that too here later. So when you gave this talk at Sunstone, I just resigned myself to say,
Not
okay,
Sunstone.
not Sunstone, excuse me. I apologize for that.
So
I don't mean to. Wow.
Just don't want people to go look for it.
Yeah,
Find it
the Torah conference. It was really a testimony builder to me that maybe we got some things wrong with this, and just a little teaser. Keep an ear out for the name Heber J. Grant in this, because I think that comes up here at some point. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so like I said, it was, you felt some tension,
right,
with this diet that you were given, and yet it was, the results were real,
right,
tangible, right? You experienced that,
not just in my blood work, how I felt, how I was able to function as a human being.
Right. I mean, and that's, I think the blood work's even more amazing, actually, right, because it's like, this is not just changing your attitude. This is changing your chemistry.
Right.
Like, that's something, that's hard to fake,
Yeah.
You can say, oh yeah, I feel better today, but you draw your blood and measure,
right,
whatever, all the things that they're measuring, and you can't fake that. So that's a testimony right there of that. What there was some true principles behind what you're doing. So I never have had that kind of experience. But when I kind of came into this idea of loving the Torah and believing that's like the foundation, and that those things still apply as far as possible, then and then also knowing the kind of standard interpretation of the word of wisdom, especially with the eating meat, then in my mind there's a conflict there, but I just kind of kept wrestling with it, and which is, I think, a healthy thing to do, is when you have what seems like a contradiction, if you can manage to kind of hold those contradictory ideas in your mind without like falling to pieces and just giving up on everything, then eventually, if you just hold on to it long enough and investigate it long enough, then you'll be able to see how things fit together. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've experienced that before. Probably you've experienced things like that before. So, and that's okay. I mean, do you know what Israel means? Like the name Israel?
To wrestle with God.
Wrestle with God. Yeah. So those who are Israelites wrestle with God. They don't just fall in line or whatever and necessarily believe everything without trying it. I think God appreciates a good wrestle, whether that's a physical wrestle or in your mind or with your faith or whatever. So this was kind of one of my wrestles, and I thought this would be a good one to present. So going to the word of wisdom, so verse 12 and 13, there say, and we've all read this
1,000 times.
Yeah, it's a short section, and it's so prevalent. It's such a prevalent part of Mormon culture. But I'll read it anyway. Yea, flesh also of beasts and of the fowls of the air, I, the Lord, have ordained for the use of man, with thanksgiving. Nevertheless, they are to be used sparingly. And it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or of cold or of famine. Okay. And, there's verse 14 and 15 kind of repeat that, or it seems like it repeats it. So we'll get into that later. But those verses, they seemed, in my mind, they seem to contradict what I call like the good old way that Father Abraham lived.
Right.
Where he was sitting in his tent in Genesis says, in the heat of the day. So this is not winter.
Right.
Nor cold nor famine. I mean, Abram was rich. he just had flocks and herds
Yeah.
plenty. He was not experiencing famine. And then he has the three visitors, right? And right away, who are angels, right?
Right.
The Lord himself is one of them. And right away, he kills a fatted calf, makes some unleavened bread, right? And so in the word of wisdom here, it says, verse 13 says, "It is pleasing unto me that they," meaning the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air, "should not be used only in times of winter, cold, or famine." So the question in my mind, or one question that you could ask is, was that pleasing what Abram did? And when I gave at the Torah conference, I think it was Benjamin said he seemed to please him. He seemed to enjoy it, right? Yeah, which is an excellent way to put it. So has what pleases the Lord changed, or is there something maybe that we're not understanding? So that's kind of the crux, and there's other things too in the Old Testament. I love the Passover. We've done an episode about Passover, and and we keep the Passover, but the Passover is in the spring. It's not in winter,
right?
And we're definitely not starving. So there's none of that other stuff either. And so, but we have a lamb and we roast it and we eat it and we invite our friends over and have a party.
And that, I want to say this too. That's unusual for ritualistic sacrifice. If you look at the bulk of ritualistic sacrifice throughout other denominations, whether that was the Phoenicians, whether that was the Romans, those things didn't get consumed. Those were supposed to be consumed by whatever God you were going to. So the fact that the Lord is saying,
let's share, let's have a meal together.
Let's have a meal, right?
Yeah.
I find interesting.
That is interesting. So now, you could just say, and many people do, not necessarily about the word of wisdom, but you could say, yeah, back then, they did that, but that stuff's been done away, but that's not, I can't lean on that. That's not part of my faith. I think I don't agree with that. So how do I reconcile with God saying in Exodus, do this Passover thing forever, and then in the word of wisdom saying, it's not pleasing to me for you to eat meat except in wintertime or whatever. So, but Joseph Smith kind of famously said, by proving contraries, truth is made manifest. So we take things that seem contrary, we butt them up against one another and twist them around and look at them from different angles, and eventually, we'll find the truth. So speaking of the Passover, the word of wisdom references the Passover directly, right? In its promises. At the end, it says, the very last verse, I, the Lord, give unto them a promise. Well, let's see. Verse 18. Sorry, verse 18. It says, I'll just paraphrase, those who do the word of wisdom and keep the commandments, then they get these promises. Verse 21 says, one of the promises is that the destroying angel shall pass by them as the children of Israel and not slay them. So this is like directly connected to the Passover, which is, again, just a weird thing if you think like the promises of the Passover are in here.
Right.
But God is saying the thing that brought about the promise is not pleasing to me.
Right.
Like that doesn't
jive. Yeah.
Yeah. and again, you could say, you could fall back again, like, yeah, but the actual Passover is done away or something. And, there's just these kind of spiritualized promises or whatever. But I read in Luke at the Last Supper. So Last Supper was just, I believe, there is some controversy on this, but I believe it was immediately before, like the night before Passover.
Right.
Right. And then Jesus was actually crucified on Passover.
Right.
So in Luke 22, they're having the Last Supper. Jesus says, with desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, and now here's the JST comes in. I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof, of the Passover, until it be fulfilled, which was written in the prophets concerning me. Then I will partake with you in the kingdom of God. Basically, he's saying
That's fascinating.
He says when the kingdom of God comes, and which is at his return, right? When I return, when I come back, I'm going to eat this Passover with you that I desire to eat, but I'm not going to get to because I'm going to be the Passover, right? But so Jesus is planning.
Which actually answers that question that I've heard many times.
What was that?
Will we eat and drink?
Well, like Jesus did.
Yeah.
Jesus proved. He's like, feel me, like see me. Yep. Oh, you don't believe? Feel. Oh, you don't believe? Give me some fish and honeycomb.
Yep.
Like I am real inside and out.
Yep.
Yeah. So he says, so the JST kind of adds, like makes it more clear. Just in the King James, you might not catch it, and you might be excused for, our Christian friends might be excused for not seeing the future fulfillment in that, but like the full fulfillment.
Right.
But I don't think the JST leaves any doubt that Jesus is going to eat the Passover when he returns. And that's going to be, again, it's going to be in the spring.
Right.
Not in the winter. So, all kinds of things. Now, let's see. So I don't know how much of this I want to get into. Basically, so I will bring this up. This is a quote from Joseph Fielding Smith. He says, "It makes no difference what is written or what anyone has said, if what has been said is in conflict with what the Lord has revealed. We can set it aside. If Joseph Fielding Smith writes something which is out of harmony with the revelations, then every member of the church is duty-bound to reject it. If he writes that which is in perfect harmony with the revealed word of the Lord, then it should be accepted." So there you go. So there's all kinds of opinions about things, even opinions by general authorities.
Right.
And they'll write commentaries on the scripture or whatever. But I think my faith is, and Joseph Fielding's faith is also, that even if someone in authority writes things that are out of harmony, then you reject them. Now, I will say, we do have to, I'm not saying that, I'll just say you just have to be kind of careful with that, because at first glance, it seems like the Doctrine and Covenants is out of harmony with the Torah.
Right.
And so you could say one or the other is mistaken, and reject it, based on what Joseph Fielding just said. But a lot of times I think a better policy is, yes, maybe something seems to be contradictory, but let's just slow down a minute and study that out a little more. And maybe when we do that, we find out that it is in harmony, and maybe we don't.
Yeah.
But let's not we don't want to jump to any hasty conclusions.
I was going to say, I think this falls into that camp, but just be patient, right? Pursue it.
Yeah.
Pursue it with ferocity, but do not be so quick to just call one or the other bad.
Right. In the end, everyone has to follow their conscience,
right?
And do what they think the scriptures and revelation and the direction from their authorities. Like, you have to kind of find a balance between those sources of inspiration.
Yep.
And and I'm not anyone's judge. So, but anyway, I do want to mention just a word about the Torah. I've said it before on here I think, but it is kind of important to know what I'm talking about when I say the Torah or the law, because there is some disagreement about that between like Jews and Christians, or Mormons too. Because when we think of the law, and I when I was a child, thinking back on like Sunday school lessons I had lessons. Actually, I had one really good teacher, and I remember he gave a lesson about keeping the Sabbath day holy, and he talked about the laws that the Jews follow, and he had us like fill out a tithing envelope, and then said, that in doing that, you just broke the Sabbath according to Jewish laws, because you're not supposed to, because you're actually like doing work, because you're creating something, like you're writing, and then you're also like sealing an envelope, which is also not allowed. Like you can't like bind or loose anything. So, and like, tying knots is forbidden. So like putting on your necktie to go to church, like according to the rabbis, that is breaking the Sabbath. And so he told us all these interesting things, unless you do it with one hand, like you can tie knots only with one hand, not two, or, there's all these kinds of things. I don't remember the whole lesson, but just like regular going to church in the eyes of the rabbis is breaking like things that we do at church is breaking the Sabbath in many ways. So to my young mind, it's like, whoa, wow, the law of Moses is really hard. That's kind of ridiculous stuff. Like that's really burdensome. And what's the problem with filling out a tithing, envelope or whatever? Later on, though, as I read the scripture for myself and do some studying, I realize that none of those things are actually in the law. That's not what the law says.
Right.
That is what the rabbis say is a law. And the Pharisees in Jesus's day, the unique thing about them, and the modern rabbinical Judaism is a descendant of Pharisaical Judaism. And the thing is, they say that there was two laws. There was two Torahs, two laws of Moses. One was the written, which we have in the 5 books of Moses. And then there was the oral law, which was given and passed down as tradition. Okay. But it was originated with Moses, and it is equally authoritative. And all of these additional rules, those all have their roots in the oral Torah. So when I speak of the Torah and the law of Moses, I am actually speaking of something different than the rabbis are. Now, the things that the rabbis do and say are beautiful and useful, but the problem is when we turn traditions into commandments.
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with tradition. I love tradition. Tradition is beautiful. But when we try to enforce it, then we have problems. And this is actually, Jesus had problems with the rabbis over this all the time. Your traditions are causing us friction here. So, okay. So the traditions, I don't believe those are enforced. We're not bound by those; they're not binding. But what is written, I do believe it's binding. So, okay, and I'm gonna move along here a little bit. Let's just go right to this, I guess. Well, okay, so I want to say one other thing about cleanliness. In section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it says, "Let all things be done in cleanliness before me." So cleanliness in the scriptures means several things, but one of them is related to our diet, like clean eating. Kosher. Yeah. Not kosher, but kosher, yes. But kosher, no. So it actually leads right into the next little story. And that is having to do with which animals, are clean or not, or what we can do as far as our diets. Now in Acts chapter 10, Peter has his vision, right? And he sees all these animals come down, and there's a voice that says, "Rise, Peter, slay and eat." And Peter says, "Not so, Lord." And he says, "Never at any time have I eaten anything that is unclean, nor common." And then the voice says, "What God has made clean, do not call common." So there wasn't an argument about the unclean. The argument that Peter was having with the Lord was about what what common is, right? Or
Right.
whether he should eat those things that are common. So, so what is common then? Common has to do with the term you just said, kosher. So, and kosher, things that are kosher follow the laws of kashrut. So this is a whole body of rules that have to do with clean eating, basically. But it's way more than cloven hoof, chews its cud, or fins and scales if it's in the water. Kashrut has even deals with the way that the animal is killed.
Right.
So there are special kinds of rabbis called sochets, and these are trained rabbis. Like, not just anyone can kill a lamb, a sheep, or a cow to eat it, or chicken, or whatever. You have to be specially trained rabbi, and there's all these additional rules you have to follow. You have to, you say these blessings. You have to immerse yourself in the mikvah before you do it. They have a special knife. It's a certain size depending on the animal, and the tip of the knife can never be. You can't plunge the knife into the neck, because the tip of the knife is not allowed to be covered by feathers or fur or flesh. So, and you have to, cut in a certain place, not too high, not too low, not too deep, and not too shallow. Like, you can cut too deep. Like, if you cut too deep and if you touch
Sure.
the bone, then that animal is not kosher anymore.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, there's I won't go through all the rules, and I don't know all the rules, but there's quite a few. And if any of the rules are violated, then the animal is unfit for consumption. It's what we would call, in the terms of in the words that Peter used, we would call it common.
Gotcha.
So those are things that the Jews sell to the Gentiles. Like, we can't eat that. Is unlawful for us to eat that. Now, the scripture doesn't actually say that's unlawful, but that's the environment that Peter's living in.
Right.
It says, rise, slay, and eat. He's like, oh, I'm not a specially trained rabbi. I don't have the ceremonial knife. I haven't done the mikvah, and
right.
If I kill it, it will be considered common, and I have never eaten anything common nor unclean, either one. So, but the Lord says, what I said is clean is like, that's good enough. I said, you can eat sheep, you can eat cows, then don't complain about, don't tell me that you can't eat a cow when I said you could.
Gotcha. So what the Lord's doing here is the Lord himself, through this dream, is breaking the false tradition.
That's right. Now, it's interesting. Some people will say that Peter's dream was about food, and some people say, no, it was about people, because, of course, Cornelius comes right after that, right? And it's interesting, when Peter goes to Cornelius's house, and he steps in the house, and he says something amazing. He says, you and I both know that what I'm doing is against the law. It's unlawful. But you read the scriptures, and there's nothing in there. There's nothing in there about Israelites can't fraternize with Gentiles under any, or vice versa. There's nothing about that. In fact, Gentiles are welcome, and but there were laws about that. But these are traditions that have become laws and become an impediment to spreading the gospel.
Right.
And so, in this one dream, basically, some people say it's again about animals, some people say it's about food, and I think it was actually about traditions. But the traditions just happen to touch on both of these topics. So all that is, partly to say that there are traditions associated with our keeping of the word of wisdom, and there are also again laws from ancient times that I don't believe Peter's dream does away with anything. Like, Peter's dream isn't, okay, you can go ahead and eat horses and snails and swine. Those things are still off the table, so to speak. And so we want to interpret I want to interpret the word of wisdom in light of all the laws that God has given, having to do with diet, and find out if I can make it fit, and interpret it through that lens. Okay, so so Abraham was not a vegetarian. Jesus was not a vegetarian. Even the resurrected Jesus was not a vegetarian.
Right.
He only, as far as we know, as far as we have record of, he ate two things:
fish and honeycomb.
Neither of which is vegan.
Right.
Nor vegetarian. Well, the honeys might be vegetarian, but
right.
They're definitely not vegetables, right?
No.
They're both an animal product.
Yeah.
So, and when Jesus is coming back, he's gonna eat the Passover and all that. So now there were and there have been religious, vegetarian movements.
Sure.
One of them was the Shakers. Okay, and we have in our Doctrine and Covenants, section 49, which was addressed to the Shakers in Ohio there, and verse 18 and 19 of section 49, say, whoso forbiddeth to abstain from meats, that man should not eat the same, is not ordained of God. For behold, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air and that which cometh of the earth is ordained for the use of man, for food and for raiment, and that he might have in abundance. So we have that, and yet there still seems to be this lingering or persistent interpretation of the word of wisdom. So one issue is in verse 13. There's a controversy about the comma. In the comma in between the words used and only, and commas punctuation can make
it can, in the English language, it can be huge. That's correct.
Like a comma can actually change the meaning to its complete opposite.
Yep,
that's right. So with the comma, and it is pleasing unto me that they, meaning the beasts and fowls mentioned in verse 12, it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used. Stop, right? There's a pause. Only in times of winter or cold or famine. What that
basically means accept, as that comma stands accept right now, right? So it's saying unless it's winter or famine, you shouldn't be eating meat.
Right. That's right.
That's the modern interpretation according to where that comma is placed.
That's right.
Right now.
Yeah. And that's a very common interpretation. But this just...
Can't get enough of the Mormon Renegade podcast? Well, good news. We're on Patreon, and there's 3 packages that you can choose from. The first one, the Slightly Rowdy package, allows you to hear the podcast without all those pesky commercials getting in the way. For those who want a slightly more in-depth experience, there's the Stirring It Up package, where you can hear ad-free audio, ad-free video, and transcripts. Finally, for those who want to go full Renegade, that package is available too, where you can get everything in the previous 2 packages, plus an extra show where myself and Ben Winfield break down the news of the day from a very Mormon point of view. You will also get exclusive access to Renegade Chat, and on there you'll be able to talk to others about the show or whatever topics are on your mind. Go to Patreon today and get your exclusive content. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by DeseretFlag.com. I've said this before and I really mean it. Mormonism isn't just a religion, it's a culture. As such, it has its own vernacular and practices, but also its own symbols. And those symbols become even more important and prominent when you look back into our history. Perhaps one of the most recognizable symbols of Mormonism is the Deseret Flag. This is the flag that I use as cover art in this podcast. This was also used for a good chunk of time during the pioneer era in Utah. Now, today we have people who want to replace the existing Utah flag with some other progressive monstrosity. Well, I think it's damn past time that we start pushing back here a little bit in Utah. Our friends at Defending Utah are here to help you with that. Now, if you go to DeseretFlag.com, you can now purchase your own Deseret State flag. It's time here that we start making ourselves known and join the resistance against those who seek to rewrite our state's history. Go to DeseretFlag.com or check out the link in this episode's page show notes and get yours today.
In my mind, and this was the thing that triggered this wrestle, is that seems to contradict those other things that we read in the New Testament and the Old Testament about Passover and Abraham and
the Doctrine and Covenants 49 even.
Yes. Right. So we want whatever interpretation we pick, we need it to be
consistent across every place where the Lord has spoken.
Coherent. We need everything to come together and knit together, rather than having like fragmented scriptures that we interpret it this way one time and this way another time. So this comma, though, is kind of controversial because it is not in the original Revelation. The comma is absent, actually, from all of the original sources that we have. So in Revelation Book 1 and Revelation Book 2 and the Sidney Gilbert notebook, and we have an old copy of Wilford Woodruff's Book of Commandments, which was given like the word of wisdom was not in the Book of Commandments, right, but it was given after, and there was blank pages at the end, and he wrote the word of wisdom in there, and there's no comma there between before only, so there's no pause there. So if we read it in that way, so no pause there, I'll read it again. And it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter or cold or famine. So if you read it that way, you could read it as, I don't want you to save them for emergencies.
Right.
It is pleasing to me for them to be used at other times as well.
Well, and here's the thing. I just have racing thoughts on this too. What does in the parable of the prodigal son, what does the father do when the son comes back?
Yeah, kills the fatted calf.
Kill the fatted calf. We're going to eat tonight. We're going to eat well. Right. And that is something that's lost on us. Now, tell me about the history of that comma then. Where does that comma come from?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Heber J. Grant.
Earmuffs. That son of a bitch.
Okay. Now we don't know if it was Heber J. Grant necessarily, but in the originals and in all of the printed versions up until 1920, the comma was absent, and so it shows up in 1920, and no one actually knows for sure who put it in there. It may even have just been like a stray mark that got accidentally turned into a comma. That's a possibility.
I want to add some historical context to this time in the 20s. Okay, up until this point, it's important to note that the word of wisdom was never on any temple recommended interview. It was absolutely, it was one of those things that you were encouraged to look at, to live by, but it was never on a recommended interview. So what's happening in the 20s in American society?
Prohibition.
Well, there's prohibition, but there's also other things happening. What we're seeing now is that there's a move in society towards a more grain-based diet.
This is a whole health.
This is a whole health
revolution,
thing, right? The Seventh-day Adventists during this time come forward front and center for the way they live and the way they eat. Very similar in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But there's also entire retreats set up around eating clean during the same time. In my opinion, looking at all that data, it's never there before 1920. It shows up during 1920. We know that there's a big push within the LDS leadership to get get the church more American, so to speak, right? Prohibition is huge, and they sign up for this wholeheartedly. Mm-hmm. And my opinion is this is one of those instances where we see the church trying to cozy up to the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's fascinating history as you look at it. There's whole resorts where, that's where cornflakes comes from. That's where grape nuts comes from.
Time of Kellogg and
yes, this is the time of
back to Eden and all that.
Yes, this all comes in that same time period.
Yeah,
which does not fit with everything else before, and now all of a sudden it becomes a thing.
Interesting. Yeah, so there are bigger pressures, like societal movements that are happening.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. So anyway, it shows up, and now there is another controversy, because even with the comma, it can still be read a couple of different ways, and that's what you think only means. Right? They should not be used only in times of winter. So only could mean except, as we mentioned before, but only could also mean solely. Like, so except is like excluding other things, but solely is kind of looking at the other way of saying just this thing only, right? This thing solely. And if you kind of like make a substitution there, and some people have argued for this, or like, yeah, the comma got put in, it wasn't in the original, but the word only actually means except, and if it means except, then the comma does not change the meaning. So I'm going to read it with and without the comma, but using the word except instead of only, and you tell me if, like, to your ear, if they sound the same. It is pleasing unto me that they should not be used except in times of winter, cold, or famine. Okay, or it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used except in times of winter, cold, or famine. So if only means except, then it is true that the comma doesn't actually change the meaning, and it means meat should be limited to these emergency times. Okay, now the problem is that it can also mean solely. So I'll put that in there. Okay, pleasing unto me that they should not be used. Let's see, we'll do it with the comma and without the comma. So comma first. Pleasing unto me that they should not be used solely in times of winter, cold, or famine, or which kind of means again that it's limited. But if I say it's pleasing unto me that they should not be used solely in times of winter, cold, or famine, then that means meat should be eaten at all times.
Right.
So if it means solely rather than except, then the meaning kind of does flip with it. So how can we tell which of those is the better reading? So there are arguments saying, look, it definitely means except, and I've seen interesting arguments. They've gone to like other sections in the Doctrine and Covenants where it clearly means, where only means except clearly. But it's interesting because just in the same section, just a verse over, in verse 15, it also uses the word only. So it's a very close verse, and also it's a very similar sounding verse to verse 13, right? Verse 13 says, it is pleasing unto me that they should not be used only in times of winter, cold, or famine. Verse 15, these hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess hunger. So they're very similar verses. And so it seems like whatever only means in 13, it's going to mean the same thing in 15.
Yeah.
It seems like a reasonable thing.
That's a reasonable assumption.
Okay. and also whatever it means, whatever you decide only means, verse 13 and verse 15 are going to mean opposite things, because verse 13 says not only, and verse 15 just says only. So whatever it is, those two verses are going to be the opposite thing because of the not. Okay, so then all we have to do is we kind of plug in the meanings of except, the meanings of only into these two verses, and understand that they are supposed to mean something opposite, and see if we get something ridiculous or something that makes sense.
Right.
That's my process.
It's a litmus test. It's a good litmus test.
So it's a kind of a logic problem. So verse 13, we're going to say only means except. Okay. And we're going to get rid of the comma for these readings here. So okay, so we'll read it again. 13. It's pleasing unto me that they should not be used except in times of winter, cold, or famine. So that means meat should be limited.
Right.
Okay. But verse 15, these hath God made for the use of man, except in times of famine and excess hunger. So what that is saying is that these, so the animals, God has made for the use of man. Man can use them except when it's famine or they're hungry, which to me sounds like a ridiculous reading. Like, why would God say you can go ahead and use whatever the animals are? You can use these animals as long as you're not starving. But if you are starving, then these animals are off limits.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
That's a ridiculous reading.
Yep.
So, which means that, to my logic, that means the word only cannot mean except, because if we plug in except into both of those verses and interpret it read it in a consistent way, then we end up with a ridiculous result.
Right.
Okay. So let's try the other sense of the word only, which is solely. So verse 13, pleasing unto me that they should not be used solely in times of winter, cold, or famine. So that means meat should not be limited to winter, cold, or famine. And then verse 15, these hath God made for the use of man solely in times of famine and excess hunger. So these, whatever these is, there's some animals that God wants you to save or leave for times when you really need it.
Right.
Which is not a ridiculous reading. Okay. But we just need to know what these are.
Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like solely is the proper sense of only.
Right.
Okay. Because we don't get something ridiculous, obviously ridiculous. So, but then that brings up the next problem, is we need to know, in verse 13, it says they should not be used. And in verse 15, it says these should be used, or are used in solely or only in times of famine and excess hunger. So we need to know what they and these mean.
Right.
So we go to verse 13. What is they? Well, it's referring to verse 12, beasts and fowls of the air. They are to be used sparingly. Okay, so they in verse 13 is the beasts and the fowls. And so is that consistent with other sections in the Doctrine and Covenants? Yes, in section 49, which we read a little bit of already, it says, behold, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air are ordained for the use of man for food, that he might have in abundance. But woe unto that man that sheddeth blood or wasteth flesh and hath no need. So that actually sounds very similar.
Yeah.
Verse 9, this is 19 and 21 of section 49, sound very similar to 12 and 13. Beasts of the field, fowls of the air, those are given to man, even to have for food, even in abundance, but don't be wasting them. That's what section 49 seems to say. And I think that's totally consistent with section 89 here too.
I find the use of the word abundance interesting there. Right?
Continue.
I feel like the word abundance could have several connotations here, right? One of them is abundance being enough, right? That you have enough sustenance.
Mm-hmm.
Scientifically speaking, I know people say, well, you can get protein from beans, and they're right, but it's a far less effective, and I've done some research and homework on this, it's a far less desirable mechanism for delivering it, because the body's got to work so much harder to extract that protein.
Yeah.
When you're talking about protein, which every human body needs, it's the right down to the DNA level, right? Protein delivers a lot of those amino acids, a lot of those.
You need nitrogen to build
nitrogen. Yeah. DNA. And so the preferred delivery mechanism for our biology is meat. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about that. The other thing that I think, and this popped out to me when I had my experience with my doctor, I had never more abundance of health.
Oh, that's interesting. You might have in abundance.
That, yes, not just in health, but free of pain.
Not just in calories, but in health.
Free of pain, of, I wasn't having those crashes. I had an abundance of energy. So I find the word abundance in 49 to be very telling. And interesting. Look, here's the thing. I'm not so dogmatic on this as to say, could some people do better on a vegetarian diet given their makeup? I'm okay. If that works for you, great. But speaking generally, you can tell what a vegan looks like or a vegetarian, right? They don't look necessarily healthy.
Depending on how strict they are, yeah.
They don't look like they're living an abundant life. Right. So I tend that word abundant, I think, carries some important connotation that I think deserves a second look.
I love that. You know what else I want to say, and I said this the last time I was on your podcast, is every true principle, even scientific principles, which nutrition is.
Yeah.
I mean, the science of nutrition is the science of chemistry and physiology, right? Every true scientific principle is a gospel principle.
Yeah.
And so we need the scriptures not only to harmonize with the previously given things, but we need to harmonize with scientific principles too.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep. And it's and if it doesn't, then we have to look at, more times than not, it's our own interpretation.
Yeah.
It's our own traditions.
Sure.
It's what we've been brought up with that deserve that second look.
An understanding problem. Yes. Yep. So I find not only section 49, but section 59 as well. This is 16 through 20 says, the fullness of the earth is yours, the beasts of the field, fowls of the air, for food, for raiment. And verse 20, it pleases God. It pleases God that he hath given all these things unto man. Verse 13. That's verse 13 in the word of wisdom. It's pleasing unto me that they should be used in a certain way. Right? It says section 59 says, it pleases God that he has given these things unto man. For this end, they were made to be used. They were made to be used with judgment. But again, it's kind of like the sparingly. Here it says in section 59, it says not to excess,
right?
Neither by extortion. And in verse 49 or section 49, it says not to waste flesh if you have no need,
right?
So when I read that, I think about I've read the accounts of that first that advanced wagon train that came across the plains in 1847. And they would hunt along the way, and there were some of the men who wanted to just shoot bison and antelope and deer just for fun, and Brian was like, we do not do that.
No,
you should. I will not allow you to kill more game than we can eat, because if we just waste that flesh, and you're wasting your ammunition and you're wasting your time besides. We got things to do. Yes, those are for us to eat. Don't kill more than you can use. Look, that's what it means, I think. You're
talking to a guy who, up until about, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, avid hunter, right? I love game. Mm. Even in those days, I couldn't get behind the idea of sport hunting. Right. It just did not sit well with me.
Yeah.
I didn't like it. Usually because those guys, and pardon the expression, were full of douchebagginess. Right. They look like they step right out of a Cabela's catalog. Right. They can't hunt in last year's fashions. Right. And so, but I couldn't get behind it. right? I felt like the animal itself deserved more reverence than what was being afforded to it to be
Interesting.
to that. And yeah, so yeah, I would agree with that.
I've never been a hunter, really. I have been hunting once, but it was a total flop. But yeah, but I have known, I have uncles and stuff that are hunters, I've known that they're very respectful.
Oh yeah.
They use the animal, and it's great. But but I have known other hunters that'll just
they're kind of bloodthirsty,
and they'll just abuse the animal. I mean, they won't. I know one guy who he won't take the time to sight in his gun.
Oh no!
So he's just like shooting him in the gut, and then they run away, and he shoots another one, because that one ran away. And it's like, you are abusing those animals. That's a crime,
Yeah.
So anyway, we're gonna get into hunting here very shortly. So, because I think the word of wisdom actually speaks on that. So, okay, so we kind of, I think we established what they is in verse 13. Beasts of the field, fowls of the air. And then, so we need to know what these is in verse 15. And I think kind of what we did in verse 13 is we went to the verse previous. In verse 15, we go to the verse previous. And the verse previous mentions beasts. Let's see. Beasts and fowls again. But we kind of already covered that in verse 12 and 13. And we know that verse 15, because of the little logic problem we did with the not and only, we know that verse 15 means the opposite. So verse 15's I don't think is talking about the beasts and the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air. I think what it's talking about is the immediate antecedent there, which in verse 14 it says, all wild animals that run or creep on the earth. So I'll read verse 14 and 15 together. All grain is ordained for the use of man and of beasts to be the staff of life, not only for man, but for the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven, and all wild animals that run and creep on the earth. And these hath God made for the use of man only in times of famine and excess of hunger. So I think that
he's obviously not talking about the grains, right?
Right.
So,
which I actually have heard people interpret it that way as well. But yeah, I think the most sense, the most logical, the most coherent way to read all of this is that verse 15, these is talking about that little parenthetical statement added about the wild animals. So I think these is the wild animals as opposed to the beasts and the fowls.
Right.
So here's where we get, so God expects us to use these two kind of, or there's three, let's just say two categories of animals in a different manner. We have the beasts and the fowls, and those are good. It is pleasing to God if we use those all the time and not save them for winter, cold, or famine. So we can have the Passover, and we can, Abram can feed his 3 heavenly guests in the heat of the day.
Dave can smoke 40 pounds of brisket for his brethren.
Yes, for his brethren. Yeah, and the prodigal son can have the fatted calf killed, and it's all pleasing. Then the other category of animals is the wild animals, and these, meaning the wild animals, God has reserved for emergency use. So another way of separating this, I think, is domesticated animals and the wild animals. And there are clean animals in both categories, right? But domesticated animals, the cows and the sheep and the chickens and the turkeys and the goats and whatever, have those all the time. Have a party. Those are given to you to use for your daily life, and also for these celebratory times when you have angelic visitors. Pull out a steak, Dave. If the 3 heavenly visitors come to you, you better pull out a steak and serve it to him. You're not gonna give him a plate of vegetables,
right?
You might end up like Abel,
Well,
or Cain rather than
yeah,
Abel,
well,
right?
and I was just thinking that, right? The use of animals goes way back, right? And I find it odd that we would say that it's not well to consume animals, but yet that was the sacrifice that was accepted
Right.
by the Lord. So,
So just to kind of sum up now, so we're going to so using solely and also understanding what the verses are referring to. We have verse 13, which is referring to clean domesticated animals. Okay. It is pleasing unto me that they should not be used solely in times of winter, cold, or famine. So use the domesticated animals all the time. That is pleasing unto me. We are not supposed to waste them. That is true, but they are for our use all the time. Then in verse 15, and these, meaning wild animals, these hath God made for the use of man solely in times of famine and excess of hunger. So in emergency situations, that's when the wild game is there for you to eat in winter, cold, or famine. Okay, and excess hunger.
can I ask you a question back in 12?
Yeah.
What do you make of the word sparingly?
Okay. So I do think it has a double meaning.
Okay.
It's kind of like your analysis of the word abundant. I really like that. So on one hand, I do think it means not to excess, like not wasting, even the animals that we are given, not wasting them. And I think that actually applies to everything that the Lord has put into our stewardship, whether it's food. Like I don't think we should waste vegetables either, if we can avoid it, or grain, right? We don't waste any of that, including, but even maybe more especially because of with the animals,
because they're sentient. They're a little
or at
more
least they're
conscious.
closer. They're a higher form of
right.
life. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So I had read something a few years back that the word sparingly has changed since the 1800s a little bit. And sparingly back then was just that. Use as much of the animal as you can is how it would apply.
Oh, interesting.
Into this. Not sparingly in terms of don't
as little as possible,
but to make sure that you are consuming as much of the animal,
wasting as little as possible.
Yes, using as much of the animal as possible. So sparingly has changed a little bit over the last 200 years or so.
Is that in Webster's 1828?
I can't remember. It might be.
I have to look that up.
It might be. I had one other question for you here, and this goes a little bit off topic, but still in the word of wisdom here. And this is one that I think I could get some flack for, but this talks about wine, right? And it's verse 5, that inasmuch as any man drinketh wine or strong drink among you, behold, it is not good, neither meat in the sight of your Father, only in assembling yourselves together to offer up your sacraments before him. The word I find interesting there is sacraments, plural.
That's correct. We're going to have to do a whole podcast on wine.
Okay. We might have to do that. But if it was for the sacrament,
right,
I think that makes sense. But sacraments, plural, all of a sudden, that makes me wonder about wedding celebrations, right? Weddings are a sacrament.
Absolutely.
Right. And some other things.
It's good enough for Jesus.
Right. Just throwing it out there.
That's right. Yeah. We we'll have to talk about that one, but that you're spot on there. Sacraments. I will mention this. In Mormon speak, we tend to use the word ordinance,
right,
to when we're talking about ceremonies, priesthood ceremonies. So baptism is an ordinance, and sealings and baby blessings and blessing the sick, like those are all ordinances, ordaining to the priesthood and so on. In most of the rest of the Christian world, those things are called sacraments. Yeah. So it will be the sacrament of baptism and the sacrament of the Lord's Supper and the sacrament of ordination and the sacrament of marriage and so on. And so our words have changed a little bit in that respect. But you go back to your kind of the original meaning, and sacraments meant these religious ceremonies. And so that includes baptisms, that includes the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, that includes Passover, that includes and many other examples of things.
The thing that I think we miss a lot with the word of wisdom is, one, going back to that word abundance. Now, I understand it's not in this particular section, but it's in 49, it's in 59. The Lord is telling you that I've set things up so you don't have to merely survive.
Yeah.
Right? Your life is meant to be celebrated.
Right.
The other thing is, we focus a lot on this in terms of the prohibitions.
Yeah. Right.
I think I think the Lord is driving something far more important to Joseph in this section than simply don't drink coffee.
Right. So, I agree. I think, the word of wisdom is telling us how to celebrate.
Yeah.
If you read it, the sacraments are celebrations as well.
Right.
Right. Those are occasions for parties.
Yeah. Yeah. Something else, where it talks in here it is in verse 4. Behold, verily thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I've warned you and forewarned you by giving unto you this word of wisdom by revelation. Look, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I don't know how you feel, but I think a lot of our food supply is tainted.
Oh, yeah.
And the more you can get away from the processed and the refined, quote, refinement, I think the better off you're going to be. And I think that's another thing Joseph's talking about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think the scriptures have plenty of things to say about producing things yourself as much as possible.
And I know it sounds weird too, but one of the things I found most interesting in my blood work was the amount of testosterone that raised.
Oh, yeah.
Just by eating kind of a cleaner diet, right? Not a lot of refined crap, a lot of protein, a lot of vegetables.
Yeah.
So
very cool.
Yeah.
Abundant.
So
going back to sparingly, I'm going to say in one sense, it means not wasting something. And it's interesting what you said about how that's changed a little bit. In another sense of the word, sparing means saving something. It has to do with salvation. And so in Exodus chapter 12, again, this is a Passover reference. Exodus 12, starting verse 26. And when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. So, in some sense, eating, like they ate the Passover, they ate the lamb in a sparing sense of the word, because they were being spared while they ate it. Right. And it was pleasing to God that they ate it sparingly.
Right.
By this sense of the word. So I do think that there is kind of a sacramental sense. It's a little bit hidden, I will admit, but I think it can be read that way. So, which is kind of a beautiful thing, actually, because as in Jewish tradition, like meat and wine, like those together are like the most joyful thing. Like that represents the best kind of party. And this isn't just a party for any old thing. Like we're talking about parties where we're celebrating, we have some holy reason to celebrate, right? The return of the prodigal son, a wedding feast, the Passover, and whatever else it is, we're the angelic visitors. We're having this meal, and we have the most joyful elements there, the wine and the meat, and that is pleasing to the Lord.
Yeah.
To use these things that He's given us for the highest possible purpose.
Right.
Okay. Now, one thing I do want to make sure that I make clear. So, although I do believe verse 15 is talking about not eating wild animals except in these emergency situations, I will also say that the word of wisdom is not saying that hunting is sinful.
Right.
Because that would, if we took that as the interpretation, that would also contradict the scripture.
Right.
Because Nephi, Lehi and his family, they're going through the wilderness, they're hunting for their sustenance, right? And never at any point is hunting by itself condemned. The only thing that's condemned is if you're wasting the animals.
And I think this even goes back to one of the first commandments that Adam's God ever gave him, which was to tend the garden.
Yeah.
Certainly, if you take the scripture literal, that man was made Lord over the whole earth.
Right.
It's not simply a blank check to go rape whatever you want from it.
Right.
There is a sense of caretaking here involved.
We tend as well.
And we tend as well. And sometimes that means when things get out of balance, you got to put them back in balance.
Sure.
And when it comes to hunting, I tend to often think it's probably a mechanism to keep all that working and tend to that garden.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, that you could totally read the word of wisdom to say like that. Yeah, that there is a time. There is a time.
Right.
To hunt the animals.
And I do find it interesting that in today's modern society, there is a time for that, right?
Yeah,
where we say it is lawful.
It's interesting also that we make hunting season in the cold parts of the year.
Yes,
don't we?
Yeah, we do. And so I do find that rather interesting. I think that I just find that sometimes as Mormons we fall into maybe the old Puritan trap of the more we suffer, the more holier we are. And certainly there's something to be said for holy suffering. I do believe that such a thing exists, but sometimes it borders on the line of, whipping ourselves, so to speak, right? Where I sometimes feel like the Lord's like, what are you doing? I tried to make this
not what I said.
Right. Not what I said. And I want you to be happy.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So let me finish this thought here.
Sorry, I keep derailing.
No, this is great. Hunting is not sinful. However, this is the word of wisdom. So right up front at the word of wisdom says this is not by way of commandment, but this is a word of wisdom. So this is something wise. I don't want, and we're looking at this one piece in particular. I don't want you to use the wild animals unless you need to, or unless it's that time of year. So we look in the scriptures in general. There are commandments given, but there's also wisdom given too. Things that are not commandments, but we can learn by people's examples, right? A lot of times the Bible and the Book of Mormon too, a lot of times there'll be stories and this thing will happen, and then the Bible doesn't actually say whether it was good or bad. It just says what happened. But I think we're meant to like learn wisdom from that. Like we see the fruit that comes of it, right? So we look in the scriptures, and for the most part, those guys that are shepherds that have domesticated animals, they are righteous. So you have Abel,
Right.
versus Cain. We have Moses and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, and even Jesus calls himself the good shepherd, right? So like shepherds, not always, but the main thrust of the scriptures is like shepherds are righteous guys.
Right.
And then on the other hand, we have hunters, and they are portrayed as wicked. So Nimrod,
Right.
and Esau, and in the Book of Mormon it says the Lamanites were. I mean, the Lamanites were hunters, went out looking for beasts in the field, and we have Enos even.
Right.
He goes out to hunt, and it doesn't say he's wicked, but we understand that he's not.
It's implied he's not on
He's
a
repenting.
Right. He's not on a good, when he starts that hunt, he's not on a good foundation with the
Right.
Lord.
And he has his wrestle, and then he doesn't finish his hunt, right? Or he doesn't read it. He doesn't tell us that he had this experience with the Lord, and then he got that deer that he was looking for, right? It doesn't say that. So anyway, again, so these are the wicked people, or people who need to repent. Now, again, there are wicked shepherds too. The Bible also talks about the evil shepherds of Israel who are abusing the flock and stuff. And there's also righteous examples of hunting. I mentioned Nephi with his bow, right? So it's not always, but it's a matter of wisdom. Again, I think the scriptures are showing by example, not by commandment, but by example, that of like the kind of behavior to model. And I will say also that as far as the commandments are concerned, shepherds are necessary,
right?
Because those sacrifices, the Passover needs to be a lamb. It's not, a moose is not allowed. So, so we are allowed to hunt, but we are required to shepherd.
Yeah.
In a word.
Yep. Okay. Absolutely.
So, and this is actually the Jewish understanding too, that actually mirrors. They look at the scriptures and say, Jews should not be hunters. Jews should be shepherds. And there are various reasons for that. They say that, but one of them is the example that's set in the scriptures. So, okay. I mean, I think that's pretty much the crux of it.
Dude, that was awesome, because I think for a lot of people, me included, this was something that I wrestled with, right? That I tried to square up with my religion, that just didn't seem to fit.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh.
I remembered finish your thought, and then I remembered something else.
I was just going to say it was, I think this was good, because if we don't look at this with a little bit of a critical eye, it's like you said, it seems like scripture contradicts itself. And if scripture contradicts itself, God contradicts himself.
Right.
And then he becomes a God you can't trust.
That's exactly right. Now, there's another question, is like, well, what do you do with like statements from the leaders, church presidents or whatever? So on one hand, we have what Joseph Fielding said, like, even if our leaders say something, if it doesn't square up, then we set it aside.
Right.
So maybe there is some of that, but also I think there's the what we talked about before, like, don't be too hasty though. So I know one of the most famous experiences that's related is I think it was Lorenzo Snow. He was out hunting, and he basically has this revelation, and it's impressed upon his mind, like, that he is doing something wicked, and he realizes, like, he's convicted in his own soul that what he was doing was wrong. He was out there hunting for the blood of little birds or something.
Oh.
And so he just, like, he has this experience, and he puts his rifle back on his shoulder and walks home, and says he's never felt the need to do that again. I don't have the quote in front of me, but I think a lot of times like that kind of gets extrapolated to, well, we shouldn't eat animals because of this revelation that Lorenzo Snow had while he was out hunting. But if you read it the way that I'm reading it, then his revelation is perfectly consistent with this reading. Mm-hmm. That, yeah, maybe he was going out to hunt and maybe it wasn't the right time and maybe it wasn't to eat. He just was doing it for sport. And that is a wicked thing. But we have to be careful that we don't take that revelation that was given for that specific time and purpose
to that one man
and like apply that broadly and to every situation, when I believe that the revelations actually make the distinction between domesticated and wild animals in the word of wisdom and in the examples given in the scriptures about shepherds versus hunters, and in the revelation given to this inspiration. I guess it wasn't a like thus saith the Lord, but it was this inspiration that Lorenzo Snow has. I think it just fits.
Right.
It actually, on the face, it might seem like it supports vegetarianism, but actually, I think it supports a more nuanced.
I think so.
And harmonious reading of the scriptures.
Yep,
so,
I think so.
So that's what I would do with those statements from the prophets, the presidents of the church, or whatever, apostles. I think many of them actually harmonize with this beautifully.
Absolutely.
If you actually look at them a little more closely,
a little more critically.
Yeah.
Right? Don't.
Yeah. So I'm not saying anything against what the leaders of the church have said, but I am speaking against one popular interpretation of the word of wisdom.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And I think we're living in such time now where, again, I really believe our food supply is tainted, and it comes with a lot of consequences that makes it hard for us to be able to hear the Lord.
Yeah.
If you're in pain, if you struggle with chronic fatigue and pain, it's hard to concentrate on anything holy or higher.
Oh, absolutely.
And I can just say from my own experience that that switching things up has been a godsend. Look, I couldn't do what I do now if I felt like I did 3-4 years ago.
I believe it.
I couldn't work a 9 to 5. I couldn't have a side job, and I definitely wouldn't have had the energy to do a podcast. Right. But things have changed. And thankfully enough, I went ahead and prayed and got my own revelation and went forward with it, despite my apprehension that, hey, this doesn't square up real well. Well, it did square up well. It was just I didn't understand.
Right.
Yeah,
and it's a beautiful thing.
And that is a good thing. So yeah, dude, this was awesome. I appreciate you so much. I always love our talks.
Pleasure.
So if anyone's feeling bad out there, eat some steak and lift some weights. So all right. See everybody next time.
See ya.